I'm also well aware that everyone's probably at capacity for the day. There's not a lot of bandwidth left. I like to think of it like we're like sponges that have already absorbed about as much as we can. And so there's a good chance that whatever I have to say is just going to spill out, and that's all right. I'm not going to be sad about it. So a little sort of, for frame of reference, this is not going to be a super technical talk. There will be some technical things that come up. I hope it's a practical talk, that it's something that's useful for you. But if you're someone who's already like, hey, I'm a TypeScript expert, like, you may not get more from this than like, hey, here's some thinking points or talking points for how I might convince someone else on my team to love TypeScript. So if you want to bail, if you were like, I really wanted a technical deep dive, just want to give you a warning, that's not this. I won't be offended if you walk out, so feel free to bail anytime during this talk. It's cool. I've wanted to walk out before. It's okay. I won't be sad. So anyway, as they said, I'm Tommy. I work at NPR. I'm a senior full-stack developer there. I've been there about 3 years now, and for the last 2 years, I've worked on the voice platforms team, which means that the bulk of the work I've been doing has been development for Amazon Alexa or Google Assistant, and then our team has also inherited some other legacy, what we call platform work, so that would be things like an app for the Fire TV and Chromecast stuff and related things. So I write a whole lot of JavaScript for stuff that doesn't necessarily run in a browser. Well, it runs in a browser, some of it, but not like on your laptop. So that's a little context for the work that I've been doing. One of the questions that comes up would be like, why are we going to talk about TypeScript? And I think in particular, the main driver for me is these stats here have been pulled from the Year in JavaScript. I don't know how many of you have seen those reports before, Year in JavaScript. They do a survey. It's pretty broad. They try and pull from a large global sample. It's fairly diverse base this last year. So this last year, so these would be stats from 2018 survey, they found that 46.6% of those who were surveyed had used TypeScript before and would use it again. There was a fairly small percentage who said, I've used it and I will never use it again. Maybe some of you in this room are in that camp. There were 33.7% who had heard of it and wanted to learn, and then there were 13% who had heard of it and not interested. So I'm just curious how this breaks out here. So how many of you have used TypeScript and would use it again? Right? So a good amount, right? Maybe half. How many of you have used it and never want to use it again? So like for real, no one? It's okay, you can be that person. It's fine. How many of you have heard of it, haven't tried it yet, but want to? All right, good, good. How many of you have heard of it and you're like, I don't really want to use it? So you guys are, this is great. I don't have to, unless you're just, I'm going to assume some of you are just like, I'm not going to raise my hand. Forget this guy. Right, yeah, they didn't come, right? There's some self-selection. Like if this was the only talk, maybe we'd have some more, right? So anyway, that maps like we're largely in the used it or have heard of it and want to use it, which is good. What I find really interesting about the trend, though, is that over the last few years, more and more people are using it, but the group that's shrinking is not necessarily those who have heard of it and want to use it. That is roughly the same. It's the people who've heard of it and don't want to use TypeScript. And I think in that sense, what that tells me is that there's people who are using TypeScript and liking it, and that the amount that as time goes on, more and more people are entertaining the idea of maybe TypeScript is for me. Maybe TypeScript is interesting or whatever. So I would say that a few years back, in 2016, I would have been in the camp of I have heard of it and I'm not interested. I was definitely a TypeScript skeptic, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So then the next question after why TypeScript is like, why me? And I think it's probably helpful to get a couple things out of the way, like reasons that aren't good reasons for me to give this talk. I'd say first off, I'm probably not the most qualified person at this conference to talk about this. Like, I'm sure there are people who could do a better job if we were trying to do a deep dive into this. I'm also not the most experienced one here. I've only worked with TypeScript for a few years now, and there are people who have been using it since it came out, and probably some people here who have used it maybe double the time that I've used it. So maybe they have more experience. Additionally, I'm probably not the most knowledgeable. There are probably people sitting in this room right now who have a deeper knowledge of how TypeScript works than I do, and that's okay. Because I think what I do have is my own story of how I kind of went from skeptic to fanboy, which is, I think, helpful if we're trying to figure out, is this something that I want to use or want to keep using? And so that story is going to be told over a couple of chapters, right? But I think before we actually get into the details of that story itself, that it might be helpful to start with a little bit about why I would say I was a skeptic. I think in general, it's helpful if we find ourselves skeptical about anything. There's different root causes of skepticism, right? And some of those are extrinsic, and some of them are intrinsic. And both extrinsic and intrinsic skepticism can be either valid or invalid, right? So not all skepticism is good. Not all skepticism is bad. So I think it's worth talking for a minute about reasons I was skeptical about TypeScript. For many of us, we are skeptical about things in general. Like if we make some general statements here, I think that there's probably been multiple nods to this or direct statements about this in this conference already, but I think as JavaScript developers, one of the things that happens is we get a little bit fatigued with the rapid evolution of the different tools and frameworks that are available to us, and that can make us skeptical about adopting anything that might require us to rethink our tool chain or the way that we've been going about doing the work that we do. So that's sort of some extrinsic skepticism that comes in for all of us and is probably somewhat valid, right? We shouldn't just be jumping on board with the next thing. But for me, I had several factors that I think contributed to some intrinsic skepticism. And hopefully, some of you all relate to those. I think something worth thinking about here, sort of two challenges I'll issue right now as we go through this and then the rest of the talk is, number one, if you're a little bit skeptical, I would say, as I'm talking about the things that made me skeptical, it may be useful for you to think about what makes you skeptical. If you're not skeptical, especially if you're someone who's using it, but you've come across others who are, whether they're on your team or other friends you're working with or junior developers that you interact with on a regular basis, whatever it might be, that you'd also try and be a bit empathetic towards them and figure out what may be making them skeptical. So that's sort of what we're going to do for the next few minutes. I think the first thing is my own background. So I do not have a computer science background. I studied theology in college, which totally set me up for the job that I'm doing. Jesus may be my homeboy, but he doesn't know jack about JavaScript or TypeScript. And so I often found myself doing this thing mentally, right? And I think this is just part of imposter syndrome for anyone that sort of comes into web development or computer science in general as like a second career move, like where I felt like, okay, so I'm learning these things, and I learned a lot of them on the fly. Like I'm maybe older than I look. I don't know how people perceive me, but I graduated high school in 1999, and so after high school, was doing some web work on, just for fun, like learning HTML and JavaScript, and had done some design, but did not see myself as a engineer or a developer or anything of the sort. And so in my mind, there were like two different types of people. There were people who like maybe could use these tools to create things for the web, and then people who were like actual engineers or developer, and I was not one of those. And so I think in my mind, I started creating buckets of like tools that I can use and then tools that real developers use. And TypeScript was one of those that I was not qualified for. Another thing is my own experience. So like my first real tech job, right? So I've worked a lot of different kinds of jobs and sort of had a very winding path to get to where I am today. But the first tech job I had was working in a support role for this like large like network telecom kind of company. And we had this 24-hour, 7 days a week network operations center. And I was working support on this team that provided worked on all the monitoring tools that those in the NOC, in the Network Operations Center, would use. And so my job was to field requests as they came in through a queue. Over time, I saw that a lot of the requests were repetitive, so I started learning to script things. At the time, a lot of the code that I was working with was like, there was some PHP, there was a lot of bash scripts and Perl that were just gluing different things together. And so I started to learn to script a little bit with that stuff and really liked it. And I had a boss who was like, if you're really into this and you want to be a software engineer, you should learn C++. And he like drops this huge college textbook on my desk with just this thunk. And I start trying to work through the thing, and I was miserable. I was so bad at it. Like, compiler errors would derail me. I didn't know who to turn to for help. And so, like, I wanted to be like this dude on the right who's clearly loving his life, but I was like Maurice Moss, and I just was angry. And I decided, like, this, again, it just reaffirmed, this kind of computer science is not for me. Like, I'm not wired for it. And so in my mind, compiled languages and typed languages were for the birds, and I would be happy with PHP, and then I learned JavaScript, and all was happy. And so then the other factor then, other than my own experience and my background, were the biases I was bringing to the table, the next job that I had. So in that environment, even after I started adding to the tools that we had and became a little bit more like a developer, even though my role was still support, we didn't have anything under version control. We would just like log into a server and do whatever you were going to do and hope it worked. The next place I worked at was an agency, and it was a little better than that, but it still was a situation where we were always overcommitted and under-resourced, and so like we never had time for anything that wasn't directly affecting how quickly we could deliver what we were supposed to be working on, right? So like things like tests and all that were just like, no, we don't have time for any of that. Like, we just get the job done quickly, which was terrible. We were actually not working in a productive way. But because of that, I started to view certain things like tests and later TypeScript as unnecessary overhead that were going to slow us down from finishing the work we needed to finish. And so because of those things, I was super skeptical. And so we'll talk here for a few minutes about what made me a fan. But I think it's worth noting that when, excuse me, when the first project that I was told, hey, we're going to do this in TypeScript, came across my desk at NPR, at first I was nervous, but and was feeling a little overwhelmed. It was going to be my first project working with Angular. We'll talk about some specifics around that in a moment. It was a big existing code base that I hadn't worked with at all, but the developer that I was going to be working with was someone I trusted, and she reassured me that she thought that TypeScript would be great and was going to be helpful for us. And so I was willing to try it out. And I think before we jump into sort of the two-part story of like how I became a fan, it's worth like giving some like a summary preview of the things that really stand out to me. Like today, if someone says to me, what is the #1 reason why someone should use TypeScript, I would say that I think TypeScript is a really powerful tool in moving a developer from a position of confusion to one of clarity around the code that they read and they write and they run. And so more specifically, it moves you from confusion to clarity while you're reading code because it makes the code more readable. We'll talk details about these things in a few moments. But also while writing the code, I know for me anyway, it has forced me to think a lot more clearly about what I'm trying to do and make sure that I don't just vaguely say, well, this thing goes here and then produces that thing. I have to actually define the things. And then also while running the code, it's made me more confident that the code that I'm writing will run. And then when we do have bugs, I'm more confident about where to find the problems. And so this point in particular about moving from confusion to clarity, I think is a good summary for my relationship to TypeScript. And so to jump into the details, this story, as told in two parts, starts in, let's see, would have been December of let's see. It starts in first half of 2017, sometime there. Can't remember the exact dates. I'll have to look them up later. But we were tasked with upgrading an Angular app. So this is a little background on this project to sort of set the scene. One of the products that we work on at NPR, I don't know if you all are familiar with it, it's called NPR One, which is basically like, elevator pitch for it would be, it's like Pandora for public radio. So the idea is your you enter into a flow where you are receiving stories that are, as the more you interact with it, the more tailored they are to your own taste, but we're not just yielding the news to like machine learning algorithms. There's also an editorial hand at the helm, making sure that you're getting up-to-date current news, even if it doesn't fall under the buckets of what you would normally listen to. So in other words, if you're like, I love stories about puppies, you'll get more stories about puppies. If you're like skipping every story about puppies, you're probably not going to get any more stories about puppies, but you probably will get stories about the president. So that's a little explanation of what this does. So we maintain a web app version that lives at one.npr.org that our team is responsible for, that the original platform team had built it before, and so when we became the voice platforms team, we just sort of pulled it in. And it's been a space where we can dog food our own SDK and APIs that power NPR1 because third parties also build clients for this product. And so the original version of this web app was built when Angular was in its release candidate 1 for the beta. So like it was running in a beta version, had never been there. And the current version at this point, I think 5 was just about to release when we started this. So we are going to make this jump from like release candidate 1 to Angular 5. And yeah, so this is end of 2017. Excuse me. And so we start this project, myself and this one other developer who was the project lead. Her name's Nara. We start working on it together, and she starts the work of upgrading. And at this point, this project had 100% unit test coverage, which, if you're here for Matt's talk, I think we also were like, yeah, full test coverage is exciting, but maybe not the best thing. So we start this process of upgrading, and I came in after maybe like 75% of the original upgrade work was done, but none of the unit tests had been updated yet. So all the tests were like, most of the tests wouldn't run because of type problems. And so I came in, and this was like my opportunity to learn this code base, to learn Angular, to learn the test framework, and to learn TypeScript all at once. And I was super intimidated. And TypeScript was super helpful. And I was really surprised that it was helping me understand this. And I want to talk to you about a few reasons why I went from skeptic to being stoked on TypeScript. And those come down to this. So that as I stepped into this code base that was new to me, I found that the presence of TypeScript made the code far more readable, and then the code itself was also self-documenting. So I don't know how many of you have experienced this before, but I've worked on projects where JSDoc is used really well, but sometimes people make code changes and do not update the doc blocks to match the changes to their code, and so what it says it takes and returns are no longer accurate. And that may not seem like a big deal, but if you're using an IDE that reads those in for its IntelliSense, then all of a sudden the contract for that function is wrong, right? And I had been bit by this in the past, so I was really impressed by the fact that, hey, like, all this code that Nara, my coworker, had updated, like, there in the function itself is this type signature that, like, let me know exactly what the contract was between this function and the things that used it, what it was going to take in and what it was going to return, and I found that to be really, really helpful. But as I was talking to other teammates at NPR about this, because we're one team among several larger teams that all collectively write a whole lot of JavaScript, one of the things that kept coming up was people would say to me, but wait, like, can't TypeScript files be like 30% longer than a JavaScript file? And this is like a rough approximation. I don't think everyone was actually saying 30%. They were probably just saying like, yeah, but that just makes our code bulkier or whatever. And sort of implicit in this statement, I think, is like a logical fallacy that shorter is better, right? Or that like somehow the shorter something is, the easier to read it is, which may be true if you have some like, you know, couple hundred line long function that no one really wants to work their way through. But a long file is not necessarily a bad file. And so one of the things that, as I started to think through this, because I was like, hey, I'm really enjoying TypeScript, why do people keep bringing up this issue of file length? I realized that this was kind of like a red herring. because we already do things that make our files longer because we know they make them more readable, right? Like, how many of you use like variable names like X instead of a well-thought-out variable name? Hopefully none of us, right? Like, we want to name things in a way that communicates what it does. And so TypeScript in the same way, maybe slightly longer, but does a really good job of telling us exactly what to expect. And so this argument is one that I started to respond to with just that point. Like, hey, when we adopt something like TypeScript, it actually makes the work that we're doing more readable to a new developer, to our future selves as we return to this code base. And so this is an idea that just doesn't hold water from my perspective. And then going on, I also found that like, as great as our IDEs are, and a lot of them at this point under the hood, whether you're using WebStorm or VS Code or whatever else, are leaning into TypeScript type files to provide definitions. No matter how great that is, the moment that we moved from JavaScript to TypeScript, we got the same sort of support for our own code. So whether that's like hinting as we're, auto-completion as we're typing things in, or on hover, getting updates about, the visual representation of exactly what the type signature of a function is, I was really surprised by how much this assisted me as I'm moving through this very large Angular code base, trying to understand what things do, and was able just to look at a function, see its contract, and then be like, oh, now I understand what we should be testing here. We can test to make sure that it does the thing it is supposed to do. I can update these tests to make sure that's what we're actually testing, and I can do it using the types that are provided, and it just works. And so it was a very great experience and a great way to learn the logic behind this app. So some of the things that people said is what I was just mentioning. Hey, like my IDE already does all this great stuff. Like, why should I add TypeScript? And I think for me it was realizing like, hey, all the great stuff it does for me with the libraries I'm using, it's either pulling that from doc blocks or from type signatures. And so it's doing the same with our code. And if we're relying on doc blocks, it is easy for that to get out of sync with the actual code that's written, where if you modify a TypeScript function but don't modify the type signature, it will just not compile. It's going to throw you an error. And if you're using like a linter, it's also going to warn you right there in your IDE. So this is just a simple example from our code where we have this function right here that just we're returning, within another function, returning a call to this function begin flow. And if you hover over it, you can see right away what the type signature is. In this instance, it's taking in what's called handler input. This comes from an Alexa skill that we wrote. I happen to know, because I've worked in this code, that handler input is just sort of this Alexa-defined request object that comes in that has all the stuff you would need from the Alexa platform based on what a user has asked Alexa to do. So I can look at that and know. If I didn't know, I could click through to exactly what it was, and then I could see that it returns a response. And if I clicked through to that response type, I'd be like, oh, this is an actual like Alexa response. So this is what we send back to a user's device. So I could look at this and say, oh, begin flow is like, it does everything. It takes us from input to response, and really helpful. And I can be confident that if this is compiling, that that's exactly what it's doing. It's not just that someone forgot to update and say, oh, actually, we're now using this other helper that this gets fed into, or something like that. So in this particular instance, this is an existing project that we're converting to TypeScript from JavaScript. And I think there's a few things that will be helpful to take away from that process. Like, I honestly think this is more difficult than starting from scratch with TypeScript, but there are some things that you can do that make that process a lot easier. I would say the first of those, oops, wrong button. First of those would be to keep things as loose as possible. So when you first set up your TypeScript config, there's a property in there called allow.js that will basically like read JS files straight in. They don't need to even be switched to .ts. So if you do that, it will compile, and as long as everything is right, even if there's no type signatures anywhere, it's working. And technically, you're using TypeScript at that point, right? Like, instead of using Babel or whatever else you were using to transpile, you've just swapped out Babel for TypeScript, and that's now doing your transpilation, your compilation for you. So you can start there. And I think by taking, when we did this, we took this approach, and it let us sort of slowly work our way through this code. And so if you start with sort of things as permissive as they can possibly be, then the bar is low, right? And I think this is an important thing to think about. I think when we were first starting this, we were thinking about this work in terms of if we're going to adopt TypeScript, everything needs to be 100% fully converted to types with strong signatures and everything else. And in reality, that's not necessarily true. And maybe you can't get there. Maybe you have a massive code base that like types would be helpful in, and you could go this route and be like, we're not actually going to convert any of these files right now, but when we add new stuff, we're going to start there. So I would recommend starting as loose as possible at the beginning. So keeping that config permissive. And then the next step is to start adding annotations in places that improve readability. So if you, like for us, like looking at this code base, and I've done this with a couple of other personal projects now, I'll look at the project and think, okay, what's the stickiest part of the code? And this seems a little unintuitive, because I think off the bat we think, okay, adding TypeScript, let me start with the easiest stuff. And we start like adding types to our constants file or whatever else, right? And like, I think it's really most helpful if you can go in and you can say, this particular function is onerous and difficult to understand, and it's where most of our challenges have come from in the past. How can we start there to add types to make sure that it's clear what's happening? And if the result is we're like, well, this thing takes all sorts of things and returns all sorts of things, maybe we need to refactor around it. So you start with the problem areas and look for those chances where you're like, hey, we're going to start here. Let this expose actual problems in our code, fix them, and work out from that space. And then as you go and you're progressively adding more meaningful definitions there, you can start to tighten your config up. So maybe you get everything switched over to .ts, and so you switch that. And then maybe you remove the flag that lets you keep implicit any imports or definitions for your things. So like everything needs some kind of type definition, even if it's explicitly saying this could be anything. You just start to tighten it up and then add the linting rules as well. And I think if you take that approach, then like whether you ever reach 100% or not, you can be confident that with each progressive step you're taking that your app is getting a little stronger, that your understanding of the types used and the architecture behind it is a little more consistent with what's actually happening. And so this was the first project that we did with TypeScript, and by the time it finished, I was like, this is great. Like, I'm really enjoying this. I feel like I have a really solid understanding of this code base, and it feels really good to work with it. And right after that, we were like, hey, we had, at this point in our team's history, we had built one Alexa skill, which was like a NPR streaming skill. So if someone said play NPR, then it would return their local stream, and they'd be able to listen. And before that, Amazon had built an NPR one skill for us when the Alexa platform first released. And they supported that for, I think, 2 years, and then we were supposed to take it over. So we were coming up on that time. And they sent us the code, and we were like, man, we knew there were some buggy things in it that we wanted changed, and some things that like just were original decisions that were made by our team as well around the design of it that we wanted to rethink. And so we thought, well, what if we rebuilt this thing? So now we had built one in JavaScript, then we'd done this TypeScript work, and so we started talking about, like, I wonder if we could do this next Alexa skill in TypeScript since we had such a good experience with it. And so the first thing we did was check and be like, well, like, it's going to be frustrating if their SDK doesn't have TypeScript support. Like, we should see if there's a types file, and there was. At that point, though the SDK was not written in TypeScript, it did have a types file with it, so it had types. So we were like, well, let's go for it. So we started doing this work, and we were able to start from scratch, right? We pulled over some, like, bare minimum framework pieces from the, like, sort of extracted some general stuff that we could use from the other skill we had built, and we started building this thing out in TypeScript. And I think almost right away, I was starting from scratch with this. There was a whole nother layer of helpfulness that I found in TypeScript that got me super excited again. And in this particular case, it was the reality that catching type errors at compilation time or even earlier, like while I was typing them because my linter was picking them up, was way better than waiting until runtime to find out that there was some sort of type error. And this is another sticking point, as I talked about this with colleagues, where they would say to me, well, why? Like, why can't these just be performed at runtime? Like, we type check all the time in our JavaScript code, and it works. Like, if it's not right, it will throw an error then. And I realized that, like, as I thought through this, I realized that the real difference here, and this was probably the biggest change that TypeScript brought to my thinking as a developer, was that if you wait to perform these checks at runtime, a runtime error is what? Is a bug, right? Like if you have a runtime error in your code, that's a bug. And a bug is an enemy, like of all software developers and teams. That means that something is wrong, whether we've shipped the code or not, and it is preventing things from working the way that we want to. And I realized as we were working through this, that when we were working with TypeScript, at first, type errors when I was trying to develop something were very irritating and a source of frustration. And it clicked for me that like, if I changed my perspective, they're actually really helpful because though a runtime error is a bug and is an enemy, I think that in reality, type errors, especially in TypeScript context, are your friends. Because what they're communicating to you is that there is something wrong in the contracts between the different pieces of what you're writing and doing. So I started to see errors like this, and instead of seeing them as a frustrating thing that was keeping me from finishing the ticket I was working on, I started seeing them as friends that were trying to point me to better code. So in this case, the first one is an example I pulled from this particular Alexa skill, where we were returning a string and acting as though it was a Boolean, which anyone who has done this in real life, it's dangerous, right? Because we could assume that, like, depending on how we're checking for that, that like we have something as true when it's not true at all. And so this particular error then, obviously, that it was just a quick check, like, well, which one of these two things is right? Like, should this be a string or should it be a Boolean? If it should be a string, then we need to change this function so that it expects a string and make sure that we're handling a string. If this shouldn't be a string, then we need to change the function that's sending it, or we need to coerce this string into a Boolean before we send it along its way. And then the second one is another type of error that you see a lot when you're working with TypeScript, where you have these other semantic errors. In this case, hey, we're passing in an object, and you're trying to assign it to a Boolean. And this one can really bite you because an empty object is not false, right? And so this is when I realized, oh, these are really helpful. Like, we've made mistakes along the way here in this code, and TypeScript is telling us now there's something wrong. And I don't know if you've come across this before in like legacy code, where you realize at some point someone changed something up the, way upstream that has resulted in like you're doing a truthy check on an object, and you realize like this is never going to be false, and we're totally messing this up. So that's when I realized, hey, these errors are friends, not enemies. And then I started to see things like this as well, where like there's an expectation. In this case, we have this type that's called tokens, and in this case, I jumped in assuming that when we had written this code, because by this time we had a few developers working on this, that it was written with both access tokens and refresh tokens, because this is authorization, right? So we're using OAuth, that both of these were going to be present in this object. And then it became clear, hey, this thing doesn't even have a refresh token in it, even though it's called tokens, right? Like, so this is a problem. We need to rework this. In other words, at this point, we have data that we think is one thing and it's not. And so again, in this case, this is an error that is letting me know, hey, your code here is making an assumption that something's present that should be there from the API, and it's not there at all. And you need to fix it. You need to make sure. Or it may be there from the API, but our type wasn't handling it correctly. But in this case, again, the error is my friend. It's letting me know, hey, you have some logical mistakes in your code. And then this is the other one that pops up, right? And at first, these were the most frustrating ones to me. But what they're actually just letting you know is, hey, TypeScript is missing information that could be really helpful. So in this case, it says, hey, you're importing this thing called Universal Analytics. We cannot find it, a type file for it anywhere, so it's just implicitly in any. So you either need to install it from npm, and if it's there, great. If the types file is not there, then you just need to add one. Even if you say, hey, this could be anything, you need to let us know about this. And so this is another space where we ended up running into, and this happens more in a node context, I think, than like in a front-end context, where some of the dependencies that we work with do not have type files. And so one of the things that became really helpful here, instead of seeing this as a point of frustration where there's no declaration file, instead of trying to write a full-fledged declaration file for this, we could say, well, what are the actual things from this that we're using, right? So let's just declare what we're using, and then we'll add to it as needed if the types don't exist. And so again, though this was initially a source of frustration, taking a step back, I realized this is just TypeScript letting me know that it's limited in what it can do in this context, and that with a very small amount of work, I can make it much better at what it does. So then if you're starting from scratch, some sort of different takeaways than the ones from before. I would say number one, what we just talked about, those errors are your friends, right? So no matter what kind of error you're encountering, it's revealing some kind of inconsistency. It's an ally. It's not an enemy. So don't get frustrated about it, but be grateful that you have discovered it now and not later. But then beyond that, there are some things that aren't your friend, and like type any is one of them. So use it when you have to. But I think unlike, if you're converting from a JavaScript project that exists to a TypeScript project, type any is necessary in some cases, right? You're not going to get there. You want to let them be there implicitly. But if you're starting from scratch, recognize that in most cases where you're going to be most tempted to use type any, those are the spaces where your types are probably the most helpful, right? Because you're tempted to use it because whatever you're trying to create a type for is difficult. And that's a good sign that the data that you're dealing with is complex. And I think the more complex your data is, the more TypeScript is going to be beneficial. So just start out with the idea that, hey, sometimes we have to keep our enemies close, so type any may be there in your code base, but like, it's not your friend. The errors are your friends. He's not your friend. And then another thing that's worth calling out here, specifically with a new project, and this is something I've actually run into several people who have tried TypeScript before and are not using it. It's because in the quick start guides, so like the TypeScript documentation is amazing. It's really solid. It's really thorough. But in their like get started in 5 minutes guide, it has you jump in with no config. And if your code structure is anything outside of just incredibly basic code right in front of you, no config is going to cause problems. So I think the key thing is to start with a config, which may be intimidating if you're like, I've never used TypeScript, and now I need to like write this config, and I don't even know what it does. But you don't actually have to write your own. There's a whole bunch of them out there, and no matter what framework you're working with, you will find examples. They exist. And so not only should you start with a config, but you should use existing tools. So if you're starting with the React app, like use Create React App, which has TypeScript support built in at this point. If you're building something with Angular, use Angular CLI, which also is going to give you a whole bunch of help with TypeScript getting started. Vue has TypeScript support available now. Most other frameworks you can think of. And on the TypeScript website, and I'll tweet out links to some of this documentation afterwards, there's a whole great set of like starter examples for configs and other things that like show you, hey, here's how to get started with TypeScript with this stuff. Getting started with TypeScript and Webpack, any number of other tools. Like there's lots available, so you don't have to re-engineer it on your own. So some resources that are helpful, and these are things that I will tweet out. There's those quick start samples I just mentioned. There's a great guide about migrating from JavaScript to TypeScript that I think would be a great companion to some of the things that I said already. In the middle of the TypeScript docs, there is this handbook that's really useful. Sorry about my email there telling me I've got something I'm supposed to be paying attention to. And then here, this TypeScript deep dive. This book, if you're someone who's like, well, I already knew all this. This talk wasn't really helpful for me. I'm already working with TypeScript. I wasted my time. If you have not read this book, this is worth sitting through. This book is amazing. It's the best resource I've come across for TypeScript. Everyone on the team at NPR now that's using TypeScript is pretty sold on his ideas. So Basra Ali Syed's book, TypeScript Deep Dive, is available for free online. Check it out. So I'll tweet links to that as well, and I'll also make sure to tweet links to the slides if you just want to grab it that way. This is the team I work with. So I just want to thank them for letting me be here instead of in the office with them. If you want to work with us, NPR is always hiring. Our specific team is not hiring right now, but DM Tech, DM Digital Media in general at NPR is hiring. So come work with us. We maintain a blog that does not get updated as much as it should, but I plan on publishing in the next few weeks a couple of TypeScript articles that may dive a little deeper than this talk, so you can check there. And you can get slides at this link. So bit.ly TypeScript fanboy. That's it. Thank you.